If you do a Google search for the word Gothic, here are the first 10 hits. You get the Wikipedia entry for Gothic, and then the Wikipedia entry for Gothic architecture. Next is Gothic Cabinet Craft, a handmade wood furniture company. Then, a link to the Gothic images on Google Images. Next two links are to community portals for Gothic horror or subculture communities. Then a link to the Gothic Theater, which is apparently Denver's best live music venue. Who knew? Following that, we have a Gothic art exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and then another link to an online community. This one professes to be a study of Gothic subculture. And finally, a Gothic beauty magazine. Now, a list like this tells us a few things about the current use of the term Gothic. First, the Gothic has its roots in an architectural aesthetic, so it's inherently visual, it's artistic. Second, this list tells us that Gothic is transgressive. It goes against normative states. It refers to a subculture, a counterculture, a body of people who self-consciously make non-normative choices, who consider themselves to be alternative, also called pejoratively freaks. Now, the website retrieved by a Google search won't tell you about the popular form of Gothic literature in the Romantic period, but it does give some indication of what we should look for in the history of this term. The Gothic fiction of the Romantic period has strongly visual and aesthetic properties, and is self-consciously transgressive, much like the modern inheritors of the term Gothic. In fact, the modern Gothic and Romantic fiction Gothic share a common ancestry. The earliest use of the term Gothic refers to the Nordic tribes that overran the Roman Empire in the 6th century. Gothic has always been a pejorative term, characterizing its subjects as barbarians. Without derogatory connotations, the label is now used to talk about an architectural form based on the pointed arch, which emerged in the middle of the 12th century. It's an architectural design practiced throughout Europe, and it lingered in some regions well into the 16th century. The pointed arch is in contrast to the rounded arch of classical architecture. Now, early 18th century architecture and poetry both trended toward neoclassical aesthetics and techniques. The architecture of Andrea Palladio strongly influenced much of the building in the early part of the 18th century, and so we sometimes call this architecture Palladian. Here are some of the properties of classical, neoclassical, Palladian architecture. It's generally symmetrical and balanced. The exterior and interior designs are simple. Ornamentation is limited. The general design is one of moderation and restraint. The buildings are brightly lit and illuminated. Overall, the aesthetic is simple and elegant. As the 18th century progressed, preferences shifted away from classical toward the Gothic. Both classical and Gothic architecture had been around for centuries, but what we have here is a matter of shifting tastes. You see Gothic images and themes appearing more frequently as the 18th century progresses. Normative aesthetics are more frequently challenged. Transgression in architecture, poetry, and life becomes a popular theme. Here are some of the features of Gothic architecture. It is an asymmetrical, unbalanced aesthetic. Buildings are visually complex, both on the exterior and interior. The design is highly ornamental. Size and scale are used to awe the viewer. Darkness and contrasting light create an eerie or unnatural feeling. Gothic architecture was the result of an engineering challenge. How do you span, in stone, wider surfaces at greater heights? How can we build larger buildings using fewer materials? Now, I'm neither an architect nor an art historian, but it's pretty easy to imagine why and how a pointed arch is more versatile. If you've ever tried to build a rounded arch out of blocks, you know that maintaining the balance of the components is significantly harder than maintaining a pointed arch. The pointed arch has a lesser lateral thrust than the rounded arch, and so it's more easily adaptable and puts less strain on the materials that form the arch. This means that buildings could now be made of lighter, thinner stone, and the walls could be opened to accommodate larger windows. The immense size of a Gothic cathedral, rising stories upward, pulls the eye to the highest point, invoking the upward pull of religious hope and the goal of leaving earth for heaven. But this upward focus also reminds the viewer of their own mortality. Man is incredibly small in comparison, and even greatness eventually falls to ruin. Along with the growing popularity of the Gothic aesthetic, we see an obsession with ruins and an interest in antiquity. If Gothic architecture forces you not only to imagine greatness, but also to contextualize your puny size, then to behold the ruin of such greatness makes you feel even smaller, transient, with life made obviously temporary and fleeting so as to make you feel both small and incredibly mortal. Not surprisingly, out of this architectural, religious, humanistic conflict comes a new breed of literature. Gothic begins in the novel, and it eventually reaches poetry. In the Gothic setting, we find stories of mystery, intrigue, fantasy, terror, and horror. These novels are read primarily by young readers with an adolescent interest in horror and romance. They're thought of as particularly susceptible readers, easily influenced. Gothic novels take place in unnatural or supernatural settings. They often invoke an interest in antiquarianism, a fascination with collecting artifacts and preserving or connecting with the past. Gothic fiction frequently asks the reader to question their own mortality and, as a corollary, their morality. If we're all going to die, then will we die and ascend to heaven or fall to hell? As you can imagine, readers of Gothic fiction shared something with those readers of the sentimental novel. They were young, they were impressionable, they were silly. They fed off the pleasure of horror and the enjoyment of terror. And like sentimental readers who measured their own morality by the magnitude of their feelings, readers of the Gothic also self identified as moral readers. Pleasure and pain, intrigue and explanation, good guys and bad guys, these all invite readers to take a side, to choose good over evil. The problem with such binary positions, antithetical positions, is, to quote Dark Helmet from the movie Spaceballs, evil will always triumph over good because good is dumb.